Hello, and welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be discussing an extremely infamous film from arguably an even more infamous director. The director being Lars von Trier, and the film being his most recent and probably most violent. The House That Jack Built. This is kind of a hard film to actually describe. On a basic plot level, we follow Jack, a serial killer, through the 1970s and 1980s. He basically narrates his whole life telling it to a man named Verge, and we go through 5 specific incidents, as he calls them. Though there's lots of other weird meta things that Jack talks about while narrating to Verge. We, however, are only going to be covering the base storyline of it, no really thematic analysis in this video. So to get right into it, we'll start with the first incident.
I will tentatively divide my tale into 5 randomly chosen incidents over a 12-year period.
Jack encounters a woman on the side of the road with a flat tire and a broken jack. Jack decides to be a kind soul and take her to a local blacksmith a few miles down the road. We listen to a dialogue between the two that's pretty meta about him looking like a serial killer and how she would just be a victim and stranded if he decided to murder her right now. It's really strange, and that's kind of how the whole movie is. However, they get to the blacksmith, he fixes the jack, and he drives her back to her car. They once again try and fix the tire, but the jack breaks again. The woman then becomes a little obnoxious, insisting that Jack take her back to the blacksmith so she can fix the jack once again and try this same thing over again. On the way to the blacksmith, Jack becomes fed up with her nonsense and bludgeons her over the head with the broken jack. A pretty graphic scene on its own, but not even close to the most horrific thing we're going to see in this movie. The second incident that Jack describes frames him as a police officer, or pretending to be one, as he approaches a random woman's house and tries to get into it to murder her. The scene itself is oddly comical, and I remember going to the theater and seeing the unrated version of this. Lars von Trier opened the film by saying that you're gonna laugh, you're gonna feel a bunch of weird emotions, and that's how you should feel. And this scene really highlights that. I'm just gonna run a little bit of it so you kind of understand what I mean by how poorly he imitates a cop.
Hang on.
Hi.
Hi. Who are you?
Police.
After that hilariously bad impersonation of a cop, he somehow cons his way inside the house and strangles the woman and stabs her to death. This is where we get introduced to the fact that Jack has OCD. Another really comical scene, he tries taking the body out but keeps having these little flashbacks, thinking that there's blood in really obscure and random places in the house. He ends up taking so much time between going back inside the house and back to his car where there's not even actually any blood in the house that a police officer eventually shows up. Jack then is somehow able to outsmart the cop by claiming that he's a friend of Claire's and that she's run away or some terrible excuse like that, and the cop leaves and Jack is able to escape freely. Not before, however, tying the body to the back of his car for whatever reason and dragging it miles across the road, leaving a giant blood trail leading to where he hides all the bodies in a giant freezer. And by an act of God or something, it begins to rain and washes away the trail leading back to the crime scene and to the freezer. The third incident kind of has a tonal shift for me personally. In it, Jack brings his current girlfriend and her 2 sons, Grumpy and George, to a shooting range. We then cut to Jack sitting in a perch overlooking the wife and her 2 kids. He has a sniper rifle in his hand. The woman is crying and panicking, and it somehow gets kind of serious here. One of the kids dashes off and tries to get to another piece of cover, and Jack shoots his leg off. It's a pretty graphic scene. He then shoots him again in the head. The second child peeks his head up, and Jack shoots him as well. We then cut to the woman crying, and they seem to be having a picnic. We then find out that after Jack killed both these kids, he sat them next to her and they're forced to have a picnic together. The woman eventually tries to escape but fails as Jack finds her and shoots her in the back. He then lays them down in a sort of ceremonial way with birds and other animals that he's killed surrounding them. This is supposed to symbolize, I guess, a successful hunt in his mind. Another tidbit that I'm kind of going to add to this is that Jack is actually a failed architect, and the reason the film is called The House That Jack Built is because he's trying to make a home for himself but constantly failing to. Now that that's out of the way, we'll get on to the fourth incident. In this incident, he and his current girlfriend are having kind of an argument. They're sitting together, Jack's a little drunk, and he eventually confesses that he has killed over 60 people. She doesn't believe him, and they continue to just have this verbal argument, and you can see where Jack's manipulative side comes out. After she realizes that he's not kidding about being a serial killer, she goes outside and tries to warn a cop who doesn't believe her and dismisses her as just being drunk. Jack then binds her and begins to cut off both of her breasts, and again, an extremely graphic scene, at least in the uncut version that I've seen. Once he does this, he keeps one of the breasts that he fastens into a wallet later, a kind of homage, I imagine, to Ed Gein, the real-life serial killer. The other breast he puts under the windshield wiper of the car of the cop from earlier. The fifth and final incident sees Jack about to commit his most grandiose killing yet. We go back to the freezer where he has accumulated a ton of dead bodies that he just keeps in there, along with 6 other people that are tied down in a triangular kind of fashion where their heads are all lined up. He plans to take his sniper rifle and shoot them all in the head at once, but before he does, one of the victims is an ex-military member and informs him that the bullet he's using would not pierce all of their skulls because it's not full metal jacket. Frustrated with this, he goes back to the gun shop that he typically buys ammunition from and scolds the worker up front for not giving him the right kind of ammo. The guy at the front desk at this point realizes that Jack is a serial killer, and for probably years he's been helping him by supplying ammunition to this guy. Jack eventually leaves with his bullet, but not before visiting a friend, SP. SP phones the police and informs them about Jack and his killings before Jack eventually murders him as well. Jack then waits for police to arrive and murders one of the officers before heading back to the freezer to finish his final kill. The military victim from earlier confirms that the bullet is full metal jacket. Jack loads the rifle, but is seemingly too close to get a good enough view on everyone. Throughout the story, the back end of the freezer that he bought was unable to be opened, but somehow is mysteriously able to be opened now. This is where Jack eventually meets Verge, who is kind of a representation of a thematic thing going on with the movie between Dante's Inferno. Verge admits that he's been observing Jack all his life and reminds him that he's actually never been able to build a home for himself. Jack then takes all of the bodies that he has accumulated over the years in this freezer, puts them together into a horrific house of corpses. Once the house is complete, the police are almost inside the freezer, sawing through a metal beam he has blocking the door. Jack and Verge then jump down this hole that has magically appeared in the freezer, and we begin the descent into hell. This final part of the film is where the link between Dante's Inferno and The House That Jack Built becomes pretty much apparent. Verge and Jack descend deeper and deeper into hell with some very honestly beautiful shots. Once at the very bottom, they come across a broken bridge. At the other side, Verge informs Jack that that's the way out of hell. There's a staircase leading up. Jack looks next to him and there's a giant rock wall leading to the other side, but however, it is over the endless abyss to hell. Jack begins climbing the wall, trying to make it to the other side. He struggles and makes it about halfway before losing his grip entirely, and we see him fall into an endless abyss. And that's how the film ends. So this movie is a bit of a wild ride. The uncut version of this film is about 3 hours long, and I don't really do this film a whole lot of justice just by explaining the 5 incidents and the end. There's a lot of weird meta things that Jack talks about while narrating because the incidents themselves don't actually take up a whole lot of time. It's mostly just him and Verge talking about Jack. This is a pretty divisive film, as I think most of Lars von Trier's films are, but if you're a fan of his, I think you'll find something to enjoy out of this. This film, I think, deserves a spot in this list because of the extremely graphic kills that we see in the uncut version and even in the normal theatrical version. However, this film is definitely not everyone's cup of tea. It's pretty divisive and long and very, very strange. But if this film sounds interesting to you, I definitely recommend checking it out, at least for the odd experience that it gives you. This has been the most disturbing films ever made, and I hope you enjoyed. See you next time.